Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a subject that I think is intensely personal and also universally pondered, suicide. And we're going to be approaching it from a philosophical angle.
That's right. We'll be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on suicide kind of as our roadmap today. So we're going to try to guide you through centuries of thought on this very complex issue.
I think what struck me right away from the reading was just how culturally loaded the very concept of suicide is.
Yeah.
The encyclopedia pointed out that ancient Greek and Latin didn't even have a word for it, a direct word for it.
It's a really fascinating point, and it speaks to the difficulty, I think, of even defining suicide objectively.
Right.
Think about how quickly we label certain deaths as suicide,
Yeah,
while others, even under very similar circumstances, we don't.
it's true. Hitler's death, for example, is almost universally considered a suicide.
Yeah.
But Socrates drinking hemlock or Jesus' crucifixion, those are rarely framed that way, even though they knew death was coming.
Exactly. Our moral judgments really get tangled up with the definition.
Yeah.
But philosophically, we need a clearer distinction. The Stanford Encyclopedia suggests that for an act to be suicidal, the person has to believe that it will lead to their death,
Okay.
and they must intend to die by doing it.
So it's not just about risky behavior, it's about intentionality.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But doesn't that get tricky sometimes?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, with a soldier jumping on a grenade to save his squad, he knows he'll die, but is that his intention?
That's where the really subtle but important difference between a foreseen outcome and an intended outcome, I think, becomes so crucial.
Yeah.
In the soldier's case, right, death is a foreseen consequence, a tragic side effect, but his intention is to save his comrades. That's a key distinction.
Okay.
Philosophers grapple with that.
So there has to be like a direct line
Yes.
between the act and the intention to die.
Yeah.
But even intending to die
Mhm.
seems complex to me.
Yeah.
It's rarely the final objective, right?
Absolutely. Suicide is often about escaping pain or making a statement, maybe even protecting others.
Right.
And death in those cases becomes a means to an end. But that underlying intent to end one's life, regardless of the method or the motivation, is at the heart of, I think, this philosophical debate.
Okay, so now that we've got a better grasp of how to even define suicide, let's kind of dive into how philosophers have tackled this issue throughout history. And we'll start with the big guns. Plato, right?
Yeah, Plato.
Plato was pretty clear that suicide was generally wrong,
Yeah.
with a few notable exceptions.
Yeah.
But he really primarily emphasized the importance of social good over individual choice.
Yeah, he did.
So suicide could be justified if it benefited society, but not for purely personal reasons.
I think that's a good summary, yeah. And interestingly, his student, Socrates, provides a really powerful example of this.
Okay.
In Plato's dialogue, Phaedo, Socrates chooses to die rather than escape his sentence.
Right.
Because he believes it upholds Athenian law and his own principles, right?
Yeah.
So it's a death for the sake of societal order, which aligned with Plato's views.
That makes sense given the ancient Greek context.
Yeah.
But how did later philosophers view this emphasis on social good over personal choice?
Well, the Stoics, who came after Plato, had a very different perspective.
Okay.
They believed that suicide was acceptable if living a good life, according to Stoic principles, was no longer possible.
Okay.
So their focus was really on individual well-being and this ability to live virtuously.
So with the Stoics, we see kind of a shift towards the individual, like a sense of autonomy over one's own life and death.
Right.
That's a pretty big departure from Plato's stance.
Yeah.
But I imagine things got even more complex with the rise of Christianity.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Christianity introduced a much stricter prohibition against suicide,
Yeah.
with St. Augustine really drawing his arguments from the commandment, thou shalt not kill.
Right.
And his influence really solidified the view of suicide as a sin.
And that perspective dominated Western thought for centuries.
Right. It really did. Thomas Aquinas, another, major figure in Christian theology, further reinforced this view.
Okay.
He argued that suicide is an act against self-love, it harms the community, and most significantly, it usurps God's authority over life and death.
So suicide became not just a moral failing, but like a theological one as well.
Precisely. But then during the Enlightenment, we start to see some pushback, against this religious dogma.
Yeah, it seems like the Enlightenment challenged a lot of traditional thinking.
Yes.
So who were some of the key figures questioning the prevailing views on suicide at that time?
One of the most prominent was David Hume.
Okay.
a Scottish philosopher who approached suicide from a secular perspective.
Okay.
He argued that suicide wasn't always a sin, and that it could be justified based on its impact on individual happiness and societal benefit.
So we're kind of returning to some of the ideas that the Stoics explored, right?
Yeah,
The individual's well-being and the circumstances surrounding their life.
exactly.
But did everyone in the Enlightenment agree with Hume's stance?
Not at all. Immanuel Kant, another, giant of Enlightenment thought, strongly opposed suicide.
Okay.
He believed it violated the autonomy of our rational will, which he saw as the foundation of our moral duty.
Okay.
So for Kant, suicide was a contradiction because it used reason to destroy reason itself.
That's fascinating. Even during the Enlightenment, a period known for challenging traditional views, there were still these strong disagreements about the nature of suicide.
Oh, absolutely.
It seems like such a complex issue, touching on so many fundamental philosophical questions.
It is, and the 19th and 20th centuries brought even more perspectives to the mix.
Right.
Romanticism, with its emphasis on emotion and individuality, often romanticized suicide.
Right.
Then you have the emergence of psychiatry, and that began to examine suicide through this kind of medical lens, attributing it to mental illness.
Right.
And then sociology kind of entered the conversation, right, focusing on these social factors that might influence suicidal behavior.
Wow, so we've journeyed from ancient Greece to the modern era, from social good to individual rights, from religious prohibition to secular justifications. It seems like the philosophical landscape surrounding suicide is just incredibly diverse and ever-evolving.
It is.
And this brings us to kind of, I think, the crux of the ethical debate.
Yeah.
Are there conditions under which suicide is morally justified?
That's the question.
That seems like the million-dollar question.
That's been debated for centuries.
And I'm eager to explore it further. But I think we've covered a lot of ground already.
We have. That's the question that's been debated for centuries, and it leads us into some fascinating ethical territory. One perspective argues that human life has inherent value, period.
Okay.
This is the sanctity of life view, which essentially makes suicide always wrong.
But how do you reconcile that view with situations where we deem killing acceptable, like self-defense or war?
That's one of the challenges critics raise. The sanctity of life argument doesn't easily account for those exceptions. Plus, some argue that it's not just about being alive, but about the quality of that life.
Right. If someone is suffering terribly with no hope of relief, shouldn't they have the right to choose?
That's a core question in the debate, and this is where religious arguments often come into play. For example, the idea that suicide goes against our natural instinct for self-preservation, or that life is a gift from God that we can't reject.
Right. Those arguments are central to the religious perspective. But didn't Hume offer some pretty compelling counterpoints to those views?
He did. Hume pointed out that we interfere with natural laws all the time in medicine and other areas. And regarding life as a gift, he argued that a gift you can't refuse isn't truly a gift. His critiques were a turning point in the philosophical discussion of suicide, shifting the focus away from purely theological arguments.
So Hume helped pave the way for a more secular approach to the ethics of suicide. And that leads us to the libertarian view, which emphasizes individual freedom.
Exactly. Libertarians generally argue that we have a fundamental right to suicide, stemming from the concept of self-ownership.
So from that perspective, it's about autonomy and the right to make choices about one's own body, even if it means ending one's life. But doesn't that get complicated when you consider the impact of suicide on others?
You've hit on a crucial point. Even if we accept the idea that suicide could be morally permissible for the individual, we can't ignore the ripple effects it has on loved ones. The emotional and often economic harm caused by suicide is undeniable.
It's true. Families especially bear the brunt of the grief and guilt. And some argue that suicide also harms society as a whole.
That's the societal harm argument. The idea is that society loses out on the individual's potential contributions. It raises the question of reciprocity. Do we owe society continued existence in exchange for the benefit that we've received?
That's a really interesting question, and it makes me think about the balance between individual rights and societal obligations. But the Stanford Encyclopedia takes this debate even further, exploring the idea that suicide could actually be a moral duty.
I know, it seems counterintuitive, but there are philosophical arguments to support this view. Utilitarianism, for instance, focuses on maximizing happiness. So if someone's continued existence causes more suffering than happiness for themselves and those around them, their death might actually result in a net increase in happiness.
In extreme cases, A person's death could be seen as the most ethical choice based on the utilitarian principle of maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people.
That's the logic behind it. And then there's John Hardwick's duty to die argument, which specifically focuses on the burdens we place on loved ones by continuing to live, especially when facing serious illness or decline. He argues that sometimes the moral thing to do is to relieve our loved ones of that burden.
But doesn't that get dangerously close to advocating for coerced suicide? What about vulnerable populations being pressured to end their lives?
Those are valid concerns, and critics of Hardwick's argument point out the potential for abuse and the ethical slippery slope of essentially making suicide an obligation. It raises a lot of difficult questions about how to balance individual autonomy with protecting those who might be vulnerable to manipulation or coercion.
It seems like this duty to die concept requires a very nuanced approach, considering all the potential risks and complexities. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the rationality of suicide. Can it ever be a truly logical choice?
That's another key area of philosophical inquiry. And thankfully, the thinking has evolved beyond the simplistic idea that you have to compare life to death to determine rationality.
Right, because who really knows what happens after death?
Exactly. The focus now is on comparing different life courses. A shorter life ended by suicide versus a potentially longer life filled with suffering or hardship.
So it's about weighing the potential benefits of continued existence against the very real suffering the individual might be experiencing. But how do you even begin to calculate something like that?
Well, philosophers have identified what they call cognitive conditions for rational suicide. This means the decision needs to be based on accurate information and a clear understanding of the potential consequences. The person needs to be able to think clearly and make a well-informed choice.
That makes sense. But how do you account for the emotional aspect of this decision? Suicide is rarely a purely rational act.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. That's why philosophers also consider interest conditions. This means the person's reasons for choosing suicide must align with their long-term goals and values. It can't be a decision made impulsively or out of temporary despair.
So it's not just about having the cognitive capacity to make a decision, but also about ensuring that the decision reflects the person's true values and desires, even in the face of immense suffering. But isn't mental illness a huge factor to consider here? Depression, for example, can really distort a person's thinking.
Absolutely. Mental illness, and especially depression, significantly complicates the question of rationality. Studies have shown a strong link between suicidal thoughts and mental illness. Depression can make it incredibly difficult to accurately assess one's situation or to envision a future where things might get better.
So while we can't automatically say that all suicides are irrational, mental illness certainly adds another layer of complexity to the discussion. It makes you wonder about the ethics of intervention. When is it justified to step in and try to prevent someone from taking their own life?
That's where we enter one of the most ethically challenging areas of this entire debate. There's a tension between respecting individual autonomy and trying to prevent harm. The Stanford Encyclopedia delves into this too, highlighting the different approaches.
So what are some of the ethical considerations when it comes to intervening in a potential suicide?
Well, there's general agreement that non-coercive methods, like persuasion or counseling, are usually acceptable. But when it comes to more forceful measures, like physical restraint or institutionalization, things become much more ethically ambiguous.
Because those actions restrict individual liberty, even if the intention is to help. It raises questions about paternalism.
Exactly. Are we justified in overriding someone's choices, even if we believe those choices are harmful? There's the no regrets approach, which suggests erring on the side of life when we're unsure if the decision is truly rational.
So, better to intervene and potentially face anger or resentment than to do nothing and risk a preventable death. But this brings up another complex issue, doesn't it? Assisted suicide.
You're right. If we accept that preventing suicide is sometimes justified, does that open the door for assisting someone in ending their life? That's a whole other ethical minefield.
And I imagine the slippery slope argument comes up a lot in these discussions.
It does. Concerns about abuse, coercion, and the potential for vulnerable populations to be exploited are central to the debate surrounding assisted suicide. It forces us to grapple with very difficult questions about the limits of autonomy, compassion, and the role of society in matters of life and death.
We've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and it's clear that there are no easy answers when it comes to the philosophy of suicide. We've explored morality, rationality, societal impact. But there's one dimension we haven't touched on yet.
Right. We focused on the ethical and practical considerations, but there's a whole other layer to this conversation. The existential questions surrounding suicide. Questions about meaning, virtue, and the very nature of human existence.
I think that's a perfect place to pick up in the final part of our deep dive. Those existential questions add yet another dimension of complexity to this already multifaceted issue. Welcome back to our deep dive into the philosophy of suicide. We've been talking about some really heavy stuff, morality, rationality, societal impact.
We've seen how philosophers from ancient Greece to the modern era have tried to define suicide, justify it, or understand its implications.
Right, but I feel like at the end of the last part, we kind of hinted that there's another layer to this whole discussion
Yeah, definitely.
that goes beyond like rules and obligations and things like that.
We've talked about whether suicide is morally permissible or rationally justifiable. But what about its implications for things like virtue, meaning the human condition?
Right. Okay, so how does virtue fit into the picture when we're talking about suicide?
Well, even if we conclude that suicide is morally acceptable in a specific situation, we can still ask if it reflects virtuous behavior.
Okay.
So is it courageous or is it born out of despair?
Right.
Does it demonstrate wisdom or is it reckless?
Okay, so instead of just focusing on like the rules, we're considering the character of the individual
Yeah,
and whether their suicide aligns with like a virtuous life.
exactly. And some philosophers argue that choosing to end one's life when it's become an unbearable burden on others, that could actually be seen as a virtuous act of self-sacrifice.
Okay.
Others might argue that persevering through suffering demonstrates greater virtue. It's really complex.
Right, and then there's the question of meaning. The Stanford Encyclopedia brought up existentialist philosophers like Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre. How do they approach the topic of suicide?
For existentialists, the meaning of life isn't predetermined or given by like a higher power.
Right.
It's something we create through our choices, our actions.
Right.
Camus, in his famous essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, actually uses suicide as the starting point for his whole philosophical exploration.
Okay, so if life is inherently meaningless, like some existentialists would argue, does suicide become a valid response?
That's the question he's wrestling with. He uses the Greek myth of Sisyphus, who is condemned to eternally push a boulder up a hill only to have it roll back down,
Right.
as a metaphor for the human condition.
I see.
Camus argues that even in the face of this absurd, repetitive existence, we can find meaning through rebellion, through continuing to strive.
So for Camus, suicide's a kind of giving up, a refusal to engage in the struggle that gives life meaning, even if that meaning is self-created.
Yeah, that's a good interpretation. Sartre, on the other hand, actually viewed suicide as the ultimate act of freedom. In a world without God or inherent meaning, we are radically free to define ourselves, even if that definition includes choosing our own end.
It's interesting how this existentialist perspective kind of ties back to our earlier discussion of autonomy, right?
Yes.
Even if suicide is morally permissible, is it a truly free and autonomous choice if it's driven by despair or a sense of meaninglessness?
That's a great point, and it highlights how interconnected these philosophical threads are. It also raises the question of whether a life filled with suffering or hardship can still be meaningful.
Right, and that's a particularly relevant question in the context of these debates about assisted suicide, right?
Absolutely. If someone is terminally ill and experiencing excruciating pain, does ending their life negate the meaning of their past experiences, their relationships, their accomplishments? Or can it be seen as a final act of autonomy, allowing them to die with dignity on their own terms?
These are incredibly profound and challenging questions. And I think it's clear that the philosophical conversation about suicide goes far beyond simple right or wrong answers.
It really does, and that's the beauty of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
It pushes us to confront these uncomfortable truths, examine our assumptions, and grapple with the complexities of human existence.
So where does this leave us? Like the non-philosophers trying to navigate all of this.
Right.
What are some key takeaways from our deep dive into the philosophy of suicide?
I think the most important takeaway is that there are no easy answers. Suicide is intensely personal, multifaceted, and it's influenced by individual circumstances, cultural norms, moral beliefs, and even just our understanding of existence itself.
Right, so it's not about like finding a one-size-fits-all solution or imposing like a rigid moral framework.
Right.
It's about engaging with this full spectrum of philosophical thought,
Yeah.
recognizing the nuances and approaching the issue with empathy and compassion.
Exactly. By understanding these diverse perspectives that philosophers have offered for centuries, we can hopefully, all of us, cultivate a more informed, nuanced, and compassionate approach to this challenging and often heartbreaking subject.
Well said. Deep divers, we've reached the end of our exploration of suicide from a philosophical perspective. But as always, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep pondering, keep questioning, keep searching for your own understanding of this incredibly complex issue. Until next time, happy diving.